Hello and welcome. This is the second of a series of videos focused on Shakespeare's history play, King Henry IV, Part 1, written around 1597 and which sort of operates as a season 2 of a 4-season series. This group of 4 plays is also referred to as a tetralogy, meaning it contains 4 parts, or some scholars have called it the Henriad, a playful adaptation of Homer's Iliad, an ancient Greek epic poem that tells of battles and trials of great heroes like Achilles, who you may have heard of. The purpose of this video is to run through all of Act 1, that's scenes 1 to 3, to draw out major concepts, characters, and quotes and connect them to the central questions Shakespeare is exploring throughout the play. Before we get started, I'm assuming that you already have a firm grip on the events in this act, so I will not be running through a plot summary. You can find a fabulous one on lit charts, which I've linked in the description below, if you're feeling a little unsteady in this department. I'm also expecting you to have a foundational understanding of the concepts listed here on this slide, which were explored in detail in my previous video, also linked in the description. Get your notebooks ready. Here we go. The agenda for this video is as follows. If you're taking notes, this is how you may want to structure them. I'll introduce each topic and subpoint as they come. So let's start with Act 1, Scene 1. Henry IV opens with the news that fierce battles have been taking place on the borders of England, all because of King Henry, the usurper's action to take the throne from his cousin, Richard II. The nobles are shaken and wan with care. Frightened peace is personified, panting in a moment of rest in the chaos of war. Synecdoche is used throughout Henry's first speech, where parts of his soldiers are used to represent the whole. He mentions their eyes and their arms, all parts of the body, but never the body as a whole, almost as if he is dismembering them with his words in the same way that his action to take the throne has led to their physical dismembering on the battlefield. Yet, Henry is hopeful that the bloody civil war may come to an end. In this line, no more the thirsty entrance of this soil shall daub her lips with her own children's blood. This metaphor represents the earth as a grotesque and unnatural mother devouring her own children. The men of England swallowed up by the dry mouth of English soil. This has strong biblical overtones, in particular the story of Cain and Abel in Genesis. In the biblical narrative, this is the first official murder after the creation of man. Cain, who is jealous of his brother and all his blessings, kills him and hides his body. Genesis 4:11 talks about how the earth opened her mouth to receive thy brother's blood from thine hand. And there are remarkable parallels between the biblical narrative and the historical actions of King Henry the usurper. In this line, Shakespeare is drawing out the question of honor and legitimacy. Aligning King Henry with Cain, the first murderer, emphasizes his greed, his ambition, and places the blame for the civil butchery taking place in England squarely on his shoulders. King Henry wishes to absolve himself of this guilt, regain his honor, and possibly his legitimacy as king. Henry is torn in the opening scenes. He needs to be strong, but feels remorse and insecurity about having usurped the throne from Richard II. He's looking for a way to reconcile himself with God. He wishes to reunite the disordered and divided English people into mutual, well-beseeming ranks and have them march all one way towards Jerusalem, where Henry wishes to free the holy fields of Israel from the Muslims in the name of God. He's been planning this crusade for a year already, and he wants to know if the council is on board. He asks, let me hear of you, my gentle cousin Westmoreland, that yesternight our council did decree. It's particularly interesting that Henry here is attempting a more distributed, collaborative style of leadership. He's trying to keep the council involved and be a bit of a team player. Unfortunately, skirmishes have broken out between the English on one side and the Scottish and Welsh rebels on the other. The king's trusted advisor, the Earl of Westmoreland, relays the bad news that Edmund Mortimer, an English military leader, has lost a battle against a band of irregular and wild Welshmen. The Welsh women have defiled the English soldiers' bodies in such a way that cannot be retold without much shame. It's assumed here that Shakespeare is referring to the practice of cutting off their genitalia, which is not good. But King Henry is an older man. He can no longer go in and fight and lead armies into battle the way that he used to. There's all this chaos going on, and he needs a noble warrior willing to fight in his name. And it looks like he may have found exactly what he needs in Henry Percy, who is nicknamed Hotspur. And it is here that we're introduced to the first of our foils, our political foil. We need to remember that Shakespeare was looking in two directions when composing Henry IV, Part 1. He was looking back to ancient Greece, to Homer and the Iliad, in order to view English history against the background of the classical heroic tradition. And at the same time, he was looking at contemporary events in the court of Elizabeth. Hotspur is an icon of classic heroism. He's the archetype that was developed in the classical epic poetry from Greece and Rome. Typically, these kinds of heroes acted in the pursuit of honor or glory. A classical hero was considered a warrior who lives and dies in the pursuit of honor and asserts their greatness with the brilliancy and efficiency with which they kill. In scene 1, young Hotspur has already defeated Douglas and his army of 10,000 and has taken several important prisoners with flair and skill. His gallant prize and honorable spoil make him the theme of honor's tongue. The repetition of these terms thematically associated with classical heroism emphasizes Hotspur's worthiness and constructs him as the epitome of that archetype. Keeping in mind Shakespeare's bidirectional view, looking backwards and looking at his current time, a question develops. Is the hero of classical antiquity just as valuable in Shakespeare's Elizabethan England, or do they need a more modern attitude to leadership and the pursuit of honor? By comparison, riot and dishonor stain the brow of his young Harry, aka Prince Hal. Our protagonist stands in direct contrast to the noble Hotspur. It's poignant that the imagery described his brow or forehead being sullied, because this is the place where the crown would rest when he becomes king, implying that his dishonorable behavior has implications for his potential as a ruler. From the very moment he is mentioned, Hal is defined by primogeniture, the expectation of what it means to be a good king, and held up in contrast to the classic archetype of a great man. We see, however, the first cracks in Hotspur's character in this scene too. Henry points out Percy's pride at choosing to keep most of the prisoners he has won for himself, rather than handing them over to the king. Strictly speaking, he didn't need to. Only Mordache, Earl of Fife, is of noble blood, so according to tradition, he's the only one that Hotspur has to give over. Everyone else he should be able to ransom or trade or execute as he wishes. But King Henry is proud. His legitimacy is shaky because of the way that he took the throne, and he fears dissent among his nobles. He perceives this, as Westmoreland puts it, as Hotspur bristling up, the crest of youth against his dignity, metaphorically painting Hotspur as a bird of prey in readiness for attack, raising the feathers on his head in anticipation. Henry feels threatened, and it is at these moments, when someone is in a state of fear, that often inadvertently they reveal their true character. Henry tosses aside plans for a holy crusade. For this cause, he says, we must neglect our holy purpose to Jerusalem. He pursues pride over penitence. And the connotations of the word neglect here, meaning to abandon, to disregard or forsake, suggest that Henry cares little for his state before God and more for the power and position he possesses. Additionally, at the end of scene 1, he makes decisions on behalf of the council, commanding them to meet next Wednesday, saying simply, inform the lords. And this stands in contrast to the discursive process of decision-making he had been attempting at the beginning of the scene, and characterizes him as a somewhat dishonorable, power-hungry, maybe unstable ruler. This is the model of leadership from which Prince Hal is destined to inherit the crown. The audience, then, is asking the question about Hal at the end of this scene. Will he be a leader like his father? And how will he compare with the classical noble warrior Hotspur? Act 1, Scene 2 takes us to a different part of the kingdom and introduces us to the second foil character. Everything about this scene contrasts with the lofty concerns and conventions of the nobility in scene 1. This parallel structure of the political plot and the comedic subplot is essential to the overarching meaning of the play. And if you are to demonstrate that you really understand this text, it's something that you must be sure to mention in any analytical response. The scene begins with Falstaff asking the time. His first line, comprised of 9 monosyllables in common prose, is almost shockingly simple when compared to the poetry and eloquence of the previous scene. The prince responds, protesting that fat-witted Falstaff, who spends all his time drinking sack or fortified wine and sleeping, has no business asking after the time of day. A few things to note about this first line from our protagonist. He speaks in prose, which is everyday language, not the rhythmic iambic pentameter that his father uses, but the language of the common man. This is our first taste of Prince Hal's performative skill, his chameleon-like talents. He can transition and transform himself to act any part. Yet he's not stupid. In fact, this first line demonstrates extraordinary verbal mastery. He uses a cornucopia of metaphors to express the humor in Falstaff being concerned about the time of day. He says, unless hours were cups of sacks, and minutes capons, and clocks the tongues of boards, and dials the signs of leaping houses, and the blessed sun himself a fair hot wench in flame-coloured taffeta, I see no reason why thou should be so superfluous to demand the time of day. Further in the scene, we see that Hal has a prodigious knack for using metaphors and similes to describe and re-describe the appearances of things until they seem to turn into their opposites. Take their discussion of hangmen, for an example. When Falstaff asks, shall there be gallows standing in England when thou art king? Do not thou, when thou art king, hang a thief? This last sentence is ambiguous. Falstaff could be asking whether Hal will hang thieves when he is king, or whether Hal will be hanged as a thief himself, since he has been involved in thievery with Falstaff. Hal replies, no, thou shalt, implying that Falstaff will die by the hangman, and then he switches it up in his next line to say, I mean thou shalt have the hanging of thieves, and so become a rare hangman. This mastery of verbal trickery, making things appear as their opposites, draws out Hal's talents at playing parts and controlling a narrative. Falstaff is by no means defeated by Hal's banter. He gives as good as he gets, and the two spend the rest of the scene engaging in a battle of wits, dueling humorously with their words. Falstaff's character very clearly mimics the appetitive part of Plato's tripartite soul. He's known to be a drunkard, he's a wanton, a thief, and spends much time in the company of prostitutes. Everything done by this man is done in the pursuit of his own pleasure and gratification. This is a man driven by the appetitive soul, and it is from him that Hal must learn to control and direct these drives within himself. In addition to his appetitive attributes, Falstaff has also been called the apolitical aspect by some critics, meaning he advocates for a world where the government and its silly rules can be put aside. He speaks of casting aside old Father Antic, the law, a reference to a well-known clown character from traditional Tudor morality plays called Antic, a vice character of chaos occasionally associated with death. Falstaff stands for the liberation of desire. He paints the law as a horrible old clown that brings misery and restriction, and he paints the anarchic underworld of men engaged in thievery and the pursuit of self in lofty terms, calling them Diana's foresters and gentlemen of the shade and minions of the moon. He even goes so far as to suggest that these men are men of good government, because they are governed by the sea as the sea is, by our noble and chaste mistress the moon, under whose countenance we steal. He is implying by these metaphors that the best form of government is no government, and as king, Hal will have to learn to restrain and control that aspect of the soul that desires within himself. The scene closes off with Hal's soliloquy. This dramatic technique allows the audience to see directly the thoughts of our protagonist, exposing his true intentions. First, note that the transition from prose to verse takes place here, where he uses iambic pentameter when he's speaking his soliloquy. This confirms Hal's noble standing, since all noble characters in Shakespeare speak this way, and it reinforces Hal's talent at playing parts. He makes use of an extended metaphor, saying, I will imitate the sun, a traditional symbol of royalty, and the imagery here suggests that he is intentionally presenting an immoral persona to the world, so that when he throws it off, the transformation is more impressive, and he is better positioned to rally the kingdom in support of his rule. This is a remarkably astute plan, especially when we recall that his father, King Henry, is perceived as a usurper. He rules a divided kingdom, and he's struggling to retain the loyalty of his nobles. All of this has contributed to the bloody chaos of war, and so it's clear that Hal's plan is nothing short of a national reunification program. The high modality in his last line, when he says, when this loose behavior I throw off, by how much better than my word I am, suggests that Hal is a studied and thoughtful young man who is behaving intentionally despite his appearance. It's Hal's development, his education, his transformation that will capture the audience's interest for the remainder of the play. Finally, we have Act 1, Scene 3. The drama transitions back to the political plot. King Henry begins the scene saying that his blood has been too cold and temperate, unapt to stir at these indignities, claiming with this synecdoche that he's been slow to anger. Having seen him flip on his plan to liberate the Holy Land, as well as his partnership with the council in Scene 1, the audience would be right to doubt this claim. In this scene, Henry dismissed Worcester merely for a look. He says, "Danger and disobedience in thine eye," saying that his mere presence is too bold and peremptory. Notice the alliteration of hard consonant sounds and plosives that emphasizes the force of Henry's anger. Henry is portrayed as an inconsistent leader and a man grasping to maintain power against increasing numbers of enemies. This meeting he set up with Hotspur is about demanding loyalty, demanding deference by demanding the prisoners Hotspur is not required to give him. How different is King Henry's method for uniting the kingdom to Hal's plan in the previous scene? Hotspur is introduced, and everything about him resonates with the hero archetype from classical antiquity. In fact, there are striking parallels between the opening of Henry IV Part 1 and the opening scenes of Homer's Iliad, the epic Greek poem that I mentioned at the beginning of this video. The Iliad describes the most famous example of the Greek hero, Achilles. Achilles is the greatest pure warrior in literary history. This soldier nearly single-handedly defeated the entire Trojan army in the Iliad. He is stronger, faster, fiercer, and simply more noble and beautiful than any other Greek. Achilles' appearance and feats on the battlefield have made him immortal in the world's imagination. This classical form of heroism was still very much alive during Shakespeare's lifetime. It's been argued that the quintessence of nobility in the Renaissance was still inextricably linked to the career of a great soldier. And this is something I think Shakespeare attempts to question. Does his world of Renaissance humanism need the heroic warrior in the same way that men in the past believed they did? In both the Iliad and Henry IV, the central conflict arises out of a quarrel over the rewards of war. Hotspur flies into a rage when Henry orders him to hand over his prisoners to an effete nobleman who's perfumed like a milliner. Not only does Hotspur not receive congratulations for the mighty battle he has won for his liege, but he was also required to hand over the spoils, leaving him with neither praise nor prize. This scenario is remarkably similar to the first book of the Iliad, where the ruler, Agamemnon, demands that Achilles give up his prisoner, Briseis, his prize after defeating a town allied with Troy. To Achilles, the loss of Briseis means the loss of honor and glory, and the anger that leads Achilles astray and dooms him is an anger that fixes his eye on one thing only, the sense of glory. He cannot be the hero he is and not protest. When Agamemnon and King Henry demand the war prizes of their greatest warriors, they're demanding more than just prisoners of war. They're forcing their soldiers to hand over their honor and glory. To answer, in part, the question posed in the previous video, that of the question of honor, where does it come from, how do we get it, is it worth having, the classical conception and Hotspur's conception of honor is that honor is earned. It's won through battle. By defeating others and emerging victorious, you win your honor. Hotspur refuses to give up the honor he has won. He explodes in anger using bestial imagery and biblical allusions when he says, "If the devil come and roar for my prisoners, I will not send them," a statement which, given the context, could imply that he's associating King Henry with the devil. Hotspur's single-minded determination to win his honor at all costs is epitomized in the alliterative line, "I will ease my heart, albeit I make a hazard of my head," which is constructed in perfect iambic pentameter, and this steady rhythm represents the singular, determined focus of this character. He's ready to risk his head to ease his fiery passion, and he sounds just like Achilles when he gives in to his anger and attempts to strike down Agamemnon. It is only with divine intervention from Athena, the goddess of war, that Achilles does not kill his commander. Similarly, Worcester and Northumberland moderate Hotspur's impulsive behavior. By the end of the scene, however, Hotspur remains a man driven to achieve glory in battle. His last line emphasizes this. He says, "Oh, let the hours be short till fields and blows and groans applaud our sport." This rhyming couplet personifies the sounds of battle. This is the applause Hotspur longs for, and his poetic expression of this desire is reminiscent of the poems of the Iliad and other classical heroes. In this scene, we also gather further evidence for Hotspur as a man directed by the spirited soul. He's controlled by the white horse. He's driven by passions. You need people like this. You need people like Hotspur if you are to be king. It is men like him that win wars. He is what any regime needs because we need warriors, but he's challenging to direct and control. His passions consume him. We see this in his first speech. He uses excessive amounts of imagery to describe the Ponzi nobleman who came to him in battle to demand his prisoners. He's ranting, calling this man fresh as a bridegroom, and his chin new reaped showed like a stubble land at harvest time. These similes are unnecessary but passionate additions to Hotspur's explanation, and he only builds in momentum, almost spitting out the plosive consonants in the alliterative metaphor to be so pestered with a popinjay. Hotspur finally admits that, out of my grief and my impatience, answered neglectingly, I know what. He should or he should not, for he made me mad. This last monosyllabic line suggests Hotspur, in that moment, has become so overwhelmed with anger that he cannot express himself in the same eloquent images he had previously. He's a man taken to being overcome with emotion, and that, he argues, is why he denied the king his prisoners. Shakespeare is exploring whether a man like this, ruled by the spirited soul, can be a good leader. In the next video, we'll go through all of Act 2. Here is a quick reminder of everything that we've explored in this video. Right now, you should think about consolidating what you've learned by pausing on the next slide and answering the questions you see there. Good luck!